tell you what genital urethra is. So the phallic part develops into, in the males, it develops into penile urethra. In the female, it develops into the vestibule. Vestibule is a common opening for urethra and vagina. Okay, now we just discussed that the urinary bladder developed from the vesical part of the urogenital sinus. The endoderm of the urogenital sinus develops into, this is all on the inside lying by endoderm. On the outside you have mesoderm, mesenchyme, whatever you want. So the endoderm of the urogenital sinus develops into the epithelium of the urinary bladder. The surrounding mesenchyme or splanchnic mesoderm develops into the muscle and connective tissue of the urinary bladder. The apex of the urinary bladder is continuous with the allantois. This allantois shrivels to form a structure which is called the urachus. This is the urachus, and in the adults, postnatal life, in the adults, this urachus is replaced by a fibrous cord which is called the median umbilical ligament that extends from the apex of the urinary bladder to the umbilicus. This develops into median umbilical ligament that extends from the apex of the urinary bladder and goes as far as the umbilicus. So trigone of the urinary bladder develops a little differently from the rest of the urinary bladder. I showed you the trigone a little while ago. Now, trigone of the urinary bladder develops from the mesonephric ducts and surrounding connective tissue. Now, this is the mesonephric ducts. This mesonephric, paramesonephric, it should be mesonephric. This mesonephric duct, you all know, before it enters into the urogenital sinus, gave rise to this outgrowth, which is the urethric bud. Now, this mesonephric duct is absorbed into the urinary bladder. As the urinary bladder, it enlarges, it absorbs this mesonephric duct into itself. As a result, this ये जो urethric open bud है, this also comes to open into the posterior wall of the urinary bladder. Now what we see is the posterior surface of the urinary bladder. Okay? So the mesonephric duct is incorporated into the posterior wall of the urinary bladder. As more and more of the mesonephric duct is absorbed into the posterior wall of the urinary bladder, the ureter, yahan tak, taking, when it is absorbed up to here, then mesonephric duct opens separately and ureter is open separately. Now, the kidney, which has ascended, by then kidneys descend kar jati hai, and they pull on the ureter, have a traction effect on the ureter. As a result, the opening of the ureter, the orifice of the ureter, that becomes supralateral, and the opening is obliquely open. So now You have the ureters opening separately. ये देख लीजिए. Those two sides may, and the mesonephric duct, they open separately into the posterior wall. As more of the mesonephric duct is absorbed, this area of the posterior wall develop. This is the trigone of the urinary bladder. And this mesonephric ducts, जो हैं, इनका जो terminal parts of the mesonephric duct, they come close to each other and open into the prostatic part of the urethra. So ये जो terminal part of the mesonephric duct, this develops into ejaculatory ducts. Ejaculatory ducts open into the pelvic part of the urogenital sinus and develop into ejaculatory ducts in the males. Females में ये part of the mesonephric duct है, ये degenerate हो जाता है. Males में the caudal-most part of the mesonephric duct develop into ejaculatory duct. Females में the caudal end of the mesonephric duct, this degenerates in the female. Epithelium जो है, that is mesodermal, लेकिन later on this is all replaced by endoderm और endodermal epithelium हो जाता है 12th week. और फिर ये जो endodermal epithelium है, this then changes to transitional epithelium. अच्छा जी, thing to remember is this is the urinary bladder. In children, in infants, the urinary bladder is in the pelvis, in the abdominal bladder. Okay? Abdominal structure होता है. 6 years पे it comes to lie in the greater pelvis over here. Or at puberty, it is lying within the puberty, lesser pelvis. And the apex of the urinary bladder is continuous with the lentois, which develops into the urachus. और urachus जो है, that develops into media and umbilical ligament. Urachus की anomalies की बात कर लेते हैं. Normally तो आपको पता है कि urachus जो है, that shrivels from apex to the umbilicus. Again, in 50% of cases, the inferior part of the urachus, this remains patent. Okay, this part of the urachus, the lower inferior part, remains patent, and it is continuous with the lumen of the urinary bladder. Okay. Now, similarly, in many cases, the lower part of the urachus, that shrivels. There is no continuity of the urinary bladder, but the upper part of the urachus remains patent and becomes continuous with the umbilicus. Okay? Now, there is another situation in which the upper part is shriveled, no continuity with the urinary bladder. The lower part has no continuity with the urinary bladder. This part shrivels. The upper part also shrivels, no continuity with the umbilicus. However, this middle part, that remains patent. Now, this urachus is also lined by endoderm, secretory epithelium. This may secrete fluid. This fluid-filled cyst or this fluid-filled sac is called urachal cyst. Now, under normal circumstances, these urachal cysts, they just persist. There's no problem anywhere, and they are only discovered at post-mortem or autopsy. But many cases, many times, what happens is this fluid-filled cyst that may get infected, and that is where People find out, oh, there is a problem, there is a urachal cyst, patent urachus. Okay? Otherwise, if a cyst gives no problems, then it just remains like this. And then there's a fourth case. When the urachus is patent throughout, it continues with the urinary bladder, remains patent throughout, and becomes continuous with the umbilicus over here. As a result, there is a possibility that urine from the urinary bladder passes through the patent urachus and dribbles out at the umbilicus. This is called urethral fistula. Okay? So obviously this has to be treated because urine goes on dripping out of the umbilicus. Now this is congenital megacystis, which is a massively enlarged urinary bladder. This is the massively enlarged urinary bladder. The cause is that mesonephric diverticulum defect, and this results in dilated renal pelvis. And of course, there are posterior urethral valves associated with it. As a result, all this, because of this maldevelopment of the kidney, pelvis of the kidney, and massively dilated urinary bladder, this results in renal failure and hypoplasia of the lungs. So survival becomes very difficult in this case. Very unfortunate condition, exostrophy of bladder, occurs in 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 40,000 live births, and males are more commonly affected. Now, this area that you see, this is the opening of the ureter, this is the opening of the ureter, so this area becomes the trigone. This is the urethra, which is open to the surface. So the trigone is what you see is that the anterior wall of the urinary bladder is missing, because trigone, you all know, is the triangular area on the posterior lower part of the posterior wall of the urinary bladder. So what you see is the posterior wall of the urinary bladder, which has this trigone. The two orifices of the urinary bladder, this is the trigone. The anterior wall of the urinary bladder is missing. अब इसमें the scrotum is bifid, ये scrotum है, which is divided into two halves. The bones of the pelvis are widely separated. There is opening of the urethra, which is called epispadias. Epispadias लिखा हुआ है. This is simply slitting open of the urethra. Now इसमें defect जो है, defect lies in the anterior abdominal wall. The anterior abdominal wall develops into is developed in two halves, a right and left. But these two halves of the anterior abdominal wall, they meet in the midline and complete the anterior abdominal wall. Now, if the anterior abdominal wall, the two halves of the anterior abdominal wall, if they do not meet in the center, in the midline, this is what happens. The two halves of the anterior abdominal wall not meeting in the midline. अब ये किस जगह पे? Below the umbilicus, lower part of the abdominal wall. They fail to meet in the midline. Up in that abdominal wall, surface ectoderm भी है और endoderm भी है. What is missing is the mesoderm. ये जो defected anterior abdominal wall है, इसमें mesoderm नहीं होगी. When there is no mesoderm, the muscles of the anterior abdominal wall, lower half of the anterior abdominal wall, they do not develop. Up lower half of the anterior abdominal wall, उसमें muscles would be rectus abdominis, external oblique, internal oblique, transversus abdominis, etc. These muscles in the lower half of the wall will not develop. Okay? So no muscles and connective tissue develops. As a result, this urinary bladder की बीच से जो endoderm है वो develop करेगी, because you know that the muscle of the urinary bladder develops from mesenchyme. When there is no mesenchyme, the muscle of the urinary bladder does not develop, and then there comes a time when this endoderm, जो membranous lining है, this also ruptures, and you can see the posterior wall of the urinary bladder. Urethra की development very quickly. Parts of the urethra हमने पहले ही कर लिया था. In fact, most of the development of the urethra we've already done. This is the prostatic part of the urethra. This develops from the vesicle and the pelvic part of the uterine sinus. ये अभी हमने किया है. This prostatic part develops from the vesicle and pelvic part of the urogenital sinus. This is the membranous part, the intermediate part. This develops from the pelvic part of the urogenital sinus. And in the female, it develops into the entire urethra. And males may now, this is the penile part. Yeah. This develops from the phallic part of the urogenital sinus. Now comes this terminal part, dilated part. Yeah, fossa navicularis. How does this work? Now, this is the glands that are the terminal part. Now, what happens is, if from the tip of the gland, here, ये सारी surface ectoderm. From the tip of the gland, ectoderm then invades the interior of the glands, a solid rod of cells. Okay? It invades inside. This rod of cells continues to grow till it comes in contact with the urethra. ये urethra जो है, ये endoderm से develop, urogenital sinus में endoderm से develop. This urethra develops from ectoderm of the surface epithelium. Yeah. So the two parts of the developing urethra, they come in contact with each other, and finally a lumen develops in this part and in this part of the urethra, and a continuity is developed. Okay? The surrounding mesenchyme, this develops into the smooth muscles and connective tissue. Females में क्या होता है? This is the trigone. This is the intermediate part of the urethra that is present in the urogenital sinus. Muscles of the urogenital sinus. Pelvic urogenital afferent. Okay. Now this part develops from this second part, which is the vesical parts से the urinary bladder develop more, pelvic parts से urethra develops more. And this is the third part, the phallic part, that develops into the vestibule of the vagina. Vestibule, I told you, was the area which was formed a common opening for the urethra and for the vagina. So this was the last slide. Do you have any questions before we jump on to the next, that is your development of the genital system? Do you have any questions so far? If there is any question, beta, do let me know. इसको repeat कर देते हैं before we start with the Next topic. I guess there are no questions. Okay, fine then. Since there are no questions regarding the development of the urinary bladder and the development of the urethra, let's start with the development of the genital system. Now, you all know that genetic sex, that is determined at the time of fertilization. Genetic sex depends on whether the X chromosome is fertilized by the X chromosome from the male or the Y chromosome. An XX complement would develop into a female and XY complement would develop into a male. Now, so it is obviously one thing is clear that the Y chromosome basically determines the genetic sex, and Y chromosome is present only in males. As a result, it is the males that determine the gender of the baby. Females के पास तो होते ही double 2x है, Y तो सिर्फ males के पास है. Now, one thing to remember is that you all know that chromosomes have genes. Okay? On the short arm of the Y chromosome, the short arm of the Y chromosome is called the sex determining region of the Y chromosome. Now, इसके genes होते हैं. The short arm of Y chromosomes have genes lodged on them, and in genes का जो protein product है ना, that is called testis determining factor, TDF. If this TDF is present, then male genital system will develop. If this TDF, testis determining factor, is absent, then female genital system develops. So all this depends on this short arm of Y chromosome, जिस पे ये SRY gene होती है, sex determining region on Y chromosome. ठीक है? Because this then is responsible for the production of a transcription factor, which is testis determining factor. Now, the genital system actually develops by the 5th week. And up to 5th week, that is between 5th and 6th week, in these 2 weeks, the genital system in both the genders is the same. So developmentally, 5th to 6th week, the genital system is similar in both the genders. That is why this stage is called indifferent stage of sexual development. That means there is no difference in the gender of the baby between 5th and 6th week. Now, just a quick recap. The urogenital system, urinary system plus the genital system, they both develop from intermediate mesoderm. Okay. And the duct system of both these urinary system and genital system, they open into the cloaca. We've already discussed that urinary system जो है, उसकी जो mesonephric duct है, that opens into the cloaca. Similarly, जो genital system की जो ducts है, they also open into the cloaca. अभी हम बात करते हैं. करते हैं. Now, when transverse folding occurs, तो ये जो mesenchyme है, this is thrown ventrally, ये देख लीजिए, and a longitudinal elevation is produced on the posterior wall. ये जो longitudinal elevation है ना, this is called a urogenital ridge. This urogenital ridge is then divided into a ventromedial part, which becomes the gonadal ridge, and a dorsolateral part is sara. This develops into nephrogenic form. So this mesenchyme on the posterior abdominal wall, this mesenchyme is covered by mesothelium, which is basically mesothelium. अभी बात करते हैं. So this mesenchyme forms a longitudinal ridge, mesenchyme on the posterior abdominal wall. This develops into a longitudinal ridge. Then it gets divided into two, ventral and medial. ये midline है, cut is in the midline. ठीक है? So a ventromedial part called the gonadal ridge, and a dorsolateral part called nephrogenic form. Let's continue with the indifferent stage of gonadal development. इसको ambisexual stage of gonadal development भी कहते हैं. ठीक है? Now अब इसमें ये देख लीजिए, this is the developing mesonephros, जिससे kidney develop हुई, and lying medial to the mesonephros, this is the developing gonad. So developing gonad is lying medial. ठीक है? Now I hope you appreciate from this diagram that the longitudinal ridges are formed medial to the developing mesonephros. Here longitudinal ridge is called, this is the developing gonad. By gonad I mean testes in the male and ovary in the female. They are the gonads. So testes and ovaries. लेकिन अभी तक it is not clear whether it develops into testis or the ovary, even though the genetic sex is already determined. Whether it's going to be a boy or a girl, that is determined genetically. लेकिन अभी genital ducts जो हैं, they have still not developed. Now, अब the gonads and this ridge, अब ये कैसे develop हुई ये ridge? Contribution कहाँ से है? Contribution develop is from epithelium covering the posterior abdominal wall, जिसको हम coelomic epithelium कहते हैं. इस epithelium के underlying mesenchyme है, local mesenchyme of that area. ठीक है? And then there is mesenchyme also that comes from this mesonephros. So mesonephric mesoderm भी contribute करेगी. And also very important, the primordial germ cells. So you have 4 structures that contribute to these gonads, formation of the genital system. Coelomic epithelium, epithelium covering the posterior abdominal wall. Then you have the underlying mesenchyme, the local mesenchyme of the area. Then you have mesenchyme from this area, mesonephric duct, mesonephric mesoderm कहते हैं, and then finally primordial germ cells. ये देख लीजिए, this is the developing mesonephros. This is dark blue is the mesonephric. This is the mesonephric duct. ठीक है जी? And ये जो lighter blue है, this is the paramesonephric duct. The dark blue is the mesonephric duct. Mesonephric duct we've already done in detail. Now developing medial to this mesonephros, this is the developing gonad. And this is the gonadulum that holds the developing gonad in its final position in the testes or as the ovaries develop in the abdomen. Please note that duct, mesonephric duct and this paramesonephric duct both open into, this is the urogenital sinus. Okay? Now let's first do what exactly do we mean by primordial germ cells. So far, do you have any questions? Achha, you want me to repeat urogenital sinus? Fine, fine. There's no problem. I'll just have to go back. Urogenital sinus तो हमने बेटा पहले भी बहुत दफा किया है. Let me go back. Urogenital sinus. Now, I hope you remember that cloaca was the dilated terminal part of the hindgut. Gut के तीन parts थे, foregut, midgut, and this is the hindgut. So cloaca is the dilated terminal part of the hindgut. This dilated terminal part of the hindgut is surrounded by mesenchyme all around. You देख लीजिए, all this pink is the mesenchyme. Now, a block of mesenchyme called the urorectal septum. This block of mesenchyme is simply developed from the surrounding mesenchyme, develops into a block of mesenchyme, and now this block of mesenchyme, this bumps into this dilated cloaca and begins to divide the cloaca into two. ये urorectal septum है, which is simply mesenchyme, and it is dividing this dilated part of the hindgut, namely the cloaca, into two. A ventral part is called urogenital sinus. This entire is the urogenital sinus, and the dorsal part is called the anorectal canal. Just say anal canal or rectum canal. This is the urogenital sinus. Please also note that the urogenital sinus, into the ventral part of the urogenital sinus, we had the opening of the allantois. Okay? Now, this urorectal septum that continues to grow caudally and comes in contact with the cloacal membrane. This is the cloacal membrane. The cloaca comes in contact with the cloacal membrane. Okay? As this urorectal septum grows caudally, the urorectal septum comes in contact with the cloacal membrane. As a result, this urorectal septum divides the cloacal membrane into two parts. The ventral part is the urogenital membrane. The dorsal part is anal membrane. So the cloacal membrane gets divided into two. A ventral part, the urogenital membrane, a dorsal part, the anal membrane. And the point where the urorectal septum touches the cloacal membrane, this point where the urorectal septum comes in contact with the cloacal membrane, this point develops into the perineal body. Okay? So the site or the point where the urorectal septum comes in contact with the cloacal membrane, ये part, this develops into the perineal membrane. So this was as far as the development of the urogenital sinus is concerned. Okay, fine. Do we have any more questions? Okay. Since we don't have any other questions, so let me continue with the germ cells. The primordial germ cells. Now, the primordial germ cells, they You're welcome, Ajay. I hope you understood. Achha ji, the primordial germ cells, they develop in the region of the epiblast. This is the epiblast, this is the hyperblast. So they develop in the region of the epiblast and then they migrate through the primitive stream. And third weekly, they come and reside over here. So from the epiblast, passing through the primitive stream, the primordial germ cells, they come and lie in the endoderm of the cranial part, dorsal wall of the yolk sac. ये yolk sac है, ये yolk sac है, ये इसकी dorsal wall का cranial end. The primordial germ cells from the epiblast, passing through the primitive stream, come to lie over here. Okay, in the endoderm cranial part, dorsal wall of the yolk sac. Now, this area is close to the developing allantois. ये allantois है. Now, I hope you understand that this is the foregut, the yellow part. This would develop in this part would develop into the midgut, and this is the hindgut. और इसी hindgut का जो dilated part था वो cloaca था. ठीक है? अच्छा. So the primordial germ cells, ये primordial germ cells हैं, endoderm, cranial part of the yolk sac in the dorsal wall. This part is close to the developing allantois. What happens is when folding occurs, ये जो dorsal part of the hindgut है, dorsal part of the yolk sac है, ये वाला part. This is incorporated into the embryo. So the yolk sac is incorporated into the embryo. Okay. Now what happens in the fourth week is okay, from the hindgut they travel into the dorsal mesentery of the hindgut, and from there they enter into the gonadal ridges. These primordial germ cells, when the yolk sac is incorporated into the body of the embryo, These cells come to lie around the hindgut. This yellow is the hindgut. मैंने आपको पिछली स्लाइड में दिखाया था. ठीक है, ये सारा, this is the hindgut. ठीक है, so they come to lie around the hindgut. From there, they pass into the dorsal. This is the mesentery of the hindgut. So they pass into the mesentery of the hindgut and then come to lie with ये gonadal ridges है. This on here and this here red में जो है ये gonadal ridges है. From the mesentery of the hindgut, they enter into the ridges, gonadal ridges. ये यहाँ पे one on either side you have the gonadal, ये जो है gonadal ridges है. So they come to lie in the gonadal ridges. From the, this is the mesentery of the hindgut. From the mesentery of the hindgut, they come to lie in the gonadal ridges. Okay. So to begin with, they are lying in the epithelium of the gonadal ridges, but 6th week में ये जो germ cells हैं, primordial germ cells, they come to lie in the mesenchyme. Now, what happens is कि ये nephrogenic cord है, ये सारा जो है engaged है. Now, epithelium on the medial side of the developing kidney, yeah, mesonephros. This is the developing kidney. You can see the glomerular is forming. So the epithelium on the medial side of the nephros, mesonephros, this begins to thicken. This thickening is produced by proliferation of the cells, epithelium, cells, epithelium. This, which is coelomic epithelium, see, I'm talking about that. Coelomic epithelium with the posterior abdominal wall. So medial to the mesonephros, the epithelium begins to thicken because in this region, that is in medial to the mesonephros, this epithelium now becomes multilayered. With the epithelium, जो underlying mesenchyme है ना, that also begins to thicken. Okay? So thickening of the overlying epithelium and thickening of the underlying mesenchyme, together they form a ridge. This ridge obviously is on the median side of the gonad of the developing mesonephros. So this ridge is called gonadal ridge or genital ridge, whatever you want to call it. Our 6th week में हमने कहा था कि the primordial germ cells, they come and lie to begin with in the epithelium of the ridge, and then they invade the underlying mesenchyme. Okay, I think I will not continue any further because there are just 2 minutes left. And do you have any questions so far? Any questions? I will continue with this on Saturday, inshallah. Inshallah. Tomorrow, I take a class on what topic will you want me to repeat? You never told me anything. So I'll do the perineum tomorrow. Anything you want me to repeat? I'll be doing the perineum tomorrow. Do you want to discuss anything other than the perineum? I guess not. So if there is no question and you don't want me to discuss anything other than the perineum, so ठीक है, that's fine, that's okay. Then I wish you all very best of luck. See you all tomorrow, inshallah. Inshallah. Have a nice time. Enjoy yourselves. वालेकुम अस्सलाम, कैसे हो बेटा? अल्लाह का शुक्र, खैरियत से हो?
हेलो, ये कौन है? फौजिया खुरम, ये हमारी क्लास की है नहीं। इनको बता दे बच्चों को आवाज आ रही है, क्लास नहीं छोड़नी। बच्चों मेरी आवाज आ रही है? किसी एक से करवा दो, लाइबा को कर दो, लाइबा को। आप बता दो क्लास नहीं छोड़नी। बच्चों क्लास आपने नहीं छोड़नी, टीचर आकर आपको ज्वाइन करते हैं।
entry of the gut migrate towards the gonadal ridges. They are first lying in the coelomic epithelium and then they invade into the underlying mesenchyme. Sorry, let me do this. G. Now, we just said that before the arrival of these primordial germ cells, the mesenchyme and the overlying epithelium this proliferates. Okay? And the surface epithelium now forms finger-like projections inside the mesenchyme. ये जो surface epithelium है, this forms these finger-like projections that project into the underlying mesenchyme. These finger-like projections formed by the surface epithelium, these are called gonadal cords or primitive sex cords. So primitive sex cords are formed by the surface epithelium that projects into the underlying mesenchyme. To begin with, these cords are still remain connected to the overlying epithelium. However, please note that the cords are still in contact with the overlying epithelium. Abhi tak, the gonad has not developed, differentiated into a testis or an ovary. So this is called an indifferent gonad. Okay. Now, with the formation of these primitive sex cords in that penetrate into the underlying mesenchyme, with the development of these sex cords, now the gonad can be divided into this surface part, which is the cortex, and this underlying part, the mesenchyme, that develops into the medulla. So now the indifferent gonad develops into a cortex surface and a medulla, underlying medulla. अच्छा जी, तो sex determination कैसे होती है? Sex determination, I told you, the Y chromosome in the males is responsible for sex determination. If the chromosome complex is XX, then a female would develop. If the chromosome complex is XY, a male will develop. Y chromosome पे short arm you have an SRY gene, and this SRY gene, this SRY gene is responsible for the production of testis determining factor. This testis determining factor is only present in the short arm of the Y chromosome. X chromosome के भी regions हैं, there are genes on the X chromosome, there are regions present in the X chromosome, and they also play a role in determining sex determination. ठीक है, genital system की development के लिए Y chromosome is also important क्योंकि उसके भी regions and genes होती हैं. ये जो sex chromosome complex होता है, whether it is an XX or an XY, this is responsible for the type of gonad that develops. In other words, ये जो आपका genetic makeup है, whether it's XX or XY, ये develop करेगा into either a testis or the ovary, depending on what the genetic makeup is. If it's an XX complement, तो फिर it will develop into an ovary. If the genetic makeup is XY, फिर it will develop into a testis. ये जो gonads हैं, testis and ovaries, they are responsible for sexual differentiation in the developing embryo. That is, the genital ducts and the external genitalia. They develop after the gonads have developed. और जो gonad पर develop होगा, उसी के accordingly genital ducts भी develop होंगी, external genitalia भी develop होगा. So if it's an XX, obviously, in that case, epididymis develop होगा, ductus deferens develop होगा, seminal vesicles develop होगा, and so on. Now, this testis determining factor, because of this, the gonad begins to produce testosterone and anti-Mullerian hormone. These two hormones are responsible for sexual differentiation in male. अभी anti-Mullerian hormone का वैसे करते हैं. The females में जो sexual differentiation है, this is not hormone dependent. It can occur even if ovaries are absent. Thing is, if there is no testosterone and no anti-Mullerian hormone, so automatically the genital ducts and external genitalia, they develop into female duct system. अच्छा जी, अब उसका influence देख लेते हैं germ cells का on indifferent gonads. अभी तक indifferent gonad चल रहा है, ठीक है? So if it is a 44XY, so there is the influence of the Y, that is short arm of the Y chromosome. So under the influence of testis determining factor, this indifferent gonad develops into testes. In the testes, the medullary cords develop कर जाते हैं, cortex degenerate कर जाता है. ठीक है, male gonad में या testes में the medullary cords develop, they differentiate. Cortical cords, they regress, they do not develop, and thick tunica albuginea also develops. Okay, females में what happens is 44XY है, Y chromosome, sorry, 44XX females में 44XX, Y chromosome is absent, so Y chromosome का influence भी नहीं होगा. जब Y chromosome का influence नहीं होगा, तो testis determining factor तो है ही नहीं. As a result, this gonad automatically develops into the ovary. जब ovary में when it develops into the ovary, sorry. In cases of ovary, the medullary cords जो है, medulla degenerate कर जाता है, cortical cords develop कर जाते हैं. अभी हमने किया था कि जो surface epithelium है, that penetrates into the underlying mesenchyme and develops into cords. ठीक है ना? ये देख लीजिए, surface epithelium developing into cords and that penetrate into the underlying medulla. Underlying mesenchyme, ये जो underlying mesenchyme जिसमें ये cords हैं, they form the medulla and this surface is the cortex. अब females में क्या होता है? Females में medullary cords जो है ये degenerate कर जाते हैं, cortical cords proliferate कर जाते हैं and there is no tunica albuginea. Males में हमने कहा था medullary cords develop करते हैं, cortical cords degenerate कर देते हैं, there is a thick tunica albuginea. So this is the difference, and the main difference comes from the influence of Y chromosome. That is testis determining factor. अच्छा जी, अब let's do the development of the testes now. So far, do you have any questions? Peter, do you have any questions so far? Do I go ahead? Since there is no questions so far, so let's go ahead with the development of testes. Now this is the developing testes. This is the developing testes. होता क्या है? बेटा, what happens is the testis determining factor induces these pores to penetrate deep into the medulla. Okay, so these pores, under the influence of testis determining factor, from the surface epithelium, these pores arise and penetrate deep into the medulla. Now, at the hilum, there is a network of cells. ये जो network of cells है, they develop from mesenchyme, mesonephric mesenchyme. ठीक है? This mesonephric mesenchyme, this gives rise to number of cells. These cells form pods, anastomosing, a network of pods. These anastomosing network of pods that develop from mesonephric mesoderm, these are called Genital testes. They develop into genital testes after testes की gross anatomy पढ़ी है. So you know that at the hilum we have a network of pods that are called genital testes. ठीक है? अब what happens is once pods have penetrated deep into the medulla, और आपको ये भी पता है कि ये pods है, they are derived from surface epithelium. अब the pods in this part of the developing testes, ये cortex है. So the cortical pods degenerate, the pods in the medulla, they proliferate. Now, look over here. There is no connection of these pods with the surface. So, cortex. This is the cortex. So, between these pods and the surface epithelium, now this structure, mesenchyme condenses and forms a thick lining, which is called tunica albuginea. So the tunica albuginea separates the cortex from the medulla. ये underlying medulla है, इसमें 6 pods हैं, ये surface epithelium है जिसमें pods degenerate कर है, and ये जो mesenchyme है, deep to the surface epithelium जो mesenchyme है, this mesenchyme develops into tunica albuginea. ठीक है जी? Now, at ये जो mesenchyme से cells develop हुए थे, that develop in pods deep in the medulla, they develop into pods of genital testes. Now, the testis at this time separates from the developing kidney and is hanging from the posterior abdominal wall by a mesentery, which is called mesorchium. Over here, this would be the mesorchium. So mesorchium is nothing but the mesentery by which the testis is hanging from the posterior abdominal wall. Achha. So the connective tissue septa, albuginum connective tissue, that develops into septa. That septa penetrate the inside of the developing testes. This divides the testes into lobes. हमने पहले बात किया था कि testis has multiple lobes और इन lobes में you had 1 to 4 seminiferous tubules. ठीक है? Now the surface epithelium, जो coelomic epithelium थी, this becomes flattened. ठीक है? अब ये जो testis की जो original mesenchyme है, the original mesenchyme lying inside this medulla, this develops into cells which are called interstitial cells of Leydig. ठीक है? So ये जो gonadal ridge की जो original mesenchyme थी, 6 to 7 weeks में this develops into this mesenchyme. This develops into interstitial cells of Leydig. These cells in 6 to 7 weeks, they start to secrete testosterone and androstenedione. It is testosterone that stimulates this gonad to develop into a testis. Okay? Then you have cells. These are the primordial germ cells that have developed into the spermatoporia. Okay? This is under the influence of Leydig cells, testosterone, that secrete testosterone and androstenedione. 6 to 7 weeks में testosterone and 8 weeks में androstenedione. अब ये जो testosterone है ना, ये under the influence of human chorionic gonadotropin. This is the testis produces the testosterone from the Leydig cells under the influence of HCG. Okay? Human chorionic gonadotropin acts on Leydig cells. These Leydig cells produce testosterone and androstenedione. Now, from the surface epithelium, from the surface epithelium arise another kind of cells that are called Sertoli cells. The Sertoli cells are responsible for the production of anti-Mullerian hormone, also called Mullerian inhibiting substance. This hormone suppresses the paramesonephric duct. ठीक है जी? So surface epithelium से cells arise that develop into Sertoli cells. These Sertoli cells then produce a hormone called anti-Mullerian hormone, also called Mullerian inhibiting substance. Mullerian इसलिए कहते हैं कि ये जो paramesonephric duct है ना, जिससे female genital tract develop होता है, इसको Mullerian duct भी कहा करते थे. So the paramesonephric duct suppress करने के लिए God has produced this hormone, anti-Mullerian hormone, and this hormone is produced only in the intrauterine life. Puberty तक चलता है, उसके बाद इसे regress कर जाता है, because then by then the male genital tract is fully developed. ठीक है? So वही बात कि it is produced, anti-Mullerian hormone is produced in puberty. Now, fourth month, the cords of the testes, they begin to elongate, and massively elongate करते हैं. As a result, there is no space to elongate further, so they bend upon themselves, forms a horseshoe-shaped structure, and the ends of these bent tubes become continuous with these cords of the rete testes. Okay, so these cords of the rete testes, the U-shaped cords, they become of the U-shaped cords of the testes. They become continuous with these cords of rete testes. ठीक है? अब ये जो cords of the testes हैं, these developing cords then develop into seminiferous tubules. If you remember, you had quite a large number of seminiferous tubules, 1 to 4 in every lobule of the testes. Now these seminiferous tubules are solid. Up till now, they are solid. Intrauterine life में, postnatal life में, in the childhood, these cords are solid cords. These solid cords acquire a lumen at puberty. So at puberty, these cords, they are canalized, meaning they acquire a lumen. These cords are lined by two types of cells we just discussed. It's Sertoli cells that secrete anti-Mullerian hormone and cells of spermatogonia cleavage. That means what we saw in the previous slide, that is, we saw the spermatogonia developing. Yeah. The large cells were spermatogonia and the smaller ones were Sertoli cells. So at this time, the seminiferous tubule is lined by these two types of cells. Okay? वो जो interstitial cells की हमने बात की थी, they are lying in between the connective tissue. ये आपको पता ही है, done histology of the bone. अच्छा जी, इसको जल्दी से कंटिन्यू कर लेते हैं. These cords, the U-shaped cords in the medulla of the testes, they become continuous with the rete testes. From the rete testes arise efferent ductules, and the efferent ductules open into this, which is the mesonephric duct. ठीक है, मैं फिर रिपीट कर देती हूँ. These tubules developing in the medulla of the testes, these rapidly proliferate, become very long. As a result, they bend upon themselves. U-shaped bend ban jata hai. The two ends of the tubule are become continuous with the tubules of the rete testes. Rete testes open into efferent ductules. Efferent ductules then open into this mesonephric ducts. Yeah, mesonephric. Okay, this mesonephric duct becomes continuous with the duct of the epididymis, and the duct of the epididymis is continuous with the ductus deferens. Okay, so your mesonephric duct here, this develops into the duct of the epididymis, and then which is continuous with the ductus deferens. अच्छा जी, so now do you have any questions? Any questions, Vita? Anything you haven't understood? Anything you haven't understood, Richard? Because with this, I finished with the development of the testes. And if you have any questions so far, before I do develop the next topic, which is development of inguinal canal, I guess there aren't any questions. See? So, beta, the thing to remember is that the testes, हमने कहा था, the gonadal ridge developed on the posterior abdominal wall. Proliferation of surface epithelium and underlying mesenchyme से gonadal ridge बनती है और gonadal ridge जो है वो फिर आगे gonad में develop करती है चाहे वो testis हो या ovary. Now the testis develops at the 10th week of development. 10th week of development पे ये जो 6th to 7th week पे शुरू हो जाता है 8th week पे hormone secrete होना शुरू हो जाते हैं. By, and I hope you appreciate one thing, that this is developing testis is lying outside the peritoneum because ये coelomic epithelium जो जिसकी proliferation से ये develop हुआ था, this coelomic epithelium is basically your peritoneum. Okay. So the testis develops outside the peritoneum. So it is extra peritoneal. The inguinal canal is something that develops in both the genders, males maybe or females maybe. 7th week में जाके ये जो this is the developing bone, developing testes. 7th week में जो mesenchyme at the inferior pole, ये इसका inferior pole है, ये superior pole. So 7th week में inferior pole जो mesenchyme है, this develops into called a rod of mesenchyme. Condensation of mesenchyme that develops into a ligamentous rod. Isme, all you have is some mucoid connective tissue and a few cells. All rod में कुछ नहीं. This rod of mesenchyme, which is attached to the inferior pole of the kidney, is called gubernaculum. So this rod of mesenchyme, the upper end is attached to the lower pole of the developing testes. I think मैं आपको यहाँ छोड़ देती हूँ. Just to invite some questions, if you have any. कोई question नहीं है? That's very good then. There are no questions. थैंक यू डॉक्टर फातिमा। अच्छा जी, so since there are no questions, I'll see you tomorrow. I'll meet with you tomorrow. नहीं, मुझे एक एक्स्ट्रा लेनी पड़ी है क्योंकि जो इस वक्त का था that person didn't come जिसके लिए क्लास थी। नो आइडिया। डॉक्टर कुल्फी मुझे कह रही थी कि आपके पास कोई पेड़ है, इस बार 10-11:30 वैसे ही हो गए दिन की बात। तो मैंने कहा जो मैं पढ़ा रही हूँ उसको मैं कंप्लीट कर लेती हूँ, जैसे उसकी डेवलपमेंट मैंने करवानी थी उसको मैंने पूरा की। उसी को मैंने खत्म कर दिया, मेरा काम हो गया। वो तो कह रही थी जो कल की ग्रॉस की क्लास है वो करवा लो। मैंने सोचा मैं इसी टॉपिक को आधा घंटे में कर दिन में क्या पढ़ा, ना इधर की ना उधर। हाँ, ये तो मेरा थोड़ा सा रह गया था जिसको मैंने कंप्लीट करना था, मैंने करवा दिया।